Good morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for your ongoing support and for joining us today. Please stay tuned after this program to find out how you can continue to support us so that we can produce these quality programs. And we'll give you a quick highlight of some terrific programs that are coming up next week and the following weeks to come. As usual, please type your questions in to the control panel on the right-hand side of the screen, and Jessica will do her very best to get to as many of your questions as possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Dan Schnur and Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Today, Dan has three terrific topics for us: the undecided voters in the 2020 election and their role, the United States versus the world, particularly a focus on Europe, and the morning headlines. We have plenty of those, Dan. So with that, I want to give you as much time to get into these meaty topics. So welcome again. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kim. And thanks to all of you for joining us again for this week's weekly webinar on politics in the time of coronavirus. You know, Jessica and I were talking after last week's program, and she noted how many of you had been wondering how there could be undecided voters still left in the electorate at this late stage in the campaign, given all the information that the American people have about the two candidates for president, particularly the incumbent. If you look at public opinion polls, you see that it very rarely adds up to 100% or anywhere close to that. Some of that is a small number of votes, much smaller than 4 years ago for third-party candidates. But a lot of it are voters who are still making up their mind. And so the several questions we received, both during and after last week's webinar, is who could possibly still be undecided? So before I try to answer that question, I'm going to put the first question to you. And so Claire, thank you very much. Question for all of you is, do you know anyone who is still undecided? Do you know anyone who is still not concluded whether they're going to vote for Trump or Biden in the general election this fall? Yeah, here we sit, a little bit over 40 days from the election. Let's see about your own circles. 10% of you, 10% say you still know someone who's undecided. 90% say no. And actually, that's a little bit larger number of undecideds, albeit once removed, than we see in the electorate overall. Most polls, the CBS News poll, the CNN poll, the Washington Post, all say that there's roughly 6% of the electorate that's undecided. The Wall Street Journal says 4%, Pew Research says 3%. And so that's not really that many undecided voters. In fact, it's less than usual by a considerable margin. And in fact, these numbers, 4, 5, 6% of undecided voters, that's roughly half of what the number of undecided voters was in the 2016 election, 6 weeks or so before the voting concluded. But what I would offer you as we go a little bit deeper into this subject, the undecided voters to pay attention to aren't necessarily those who don't yet know which candidate they'll vote for. The more important group are those who are leaning toward a candidate, but not yet absolutely certain. So they'll show up in the polls supporting Biden or Trump, but we'll call those weak partisans as opposed to committed partisans, because while they are leaning in one direction, and if the election were today, would intend to vote for their preferred candidate, that's not completely nailed down. Who are those voters? Well, many of them are seniors, older voters who switched from Trump to Biden over the course of the spring and summer because of their concern with the way the president was handling the coronavirus. Many others are white working class voters, particularly white working class women who switched from Trump to Biden earlier this year in the aftermath of George Floyd's death and the ensuing demonstrations and protests. These two subgroups have moved in fairly large numbers from Trump to Biden since early this year, which accounts for Biden maintaining still his lead in national and most state polls, most contested swing state polls. But they're not necessarily nailed down. And as I think you can tell from the Trump campaign, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, the president and his campaign team are still working very hard to win back those weaker partisans, those who are leaning toward Biden but not completely decided. Now, even more important, 1/3 group of undecided voters, even more important than those first two, are those who are undecided not about who they'll vote for, but undecided about whether they'll vote or not. And this is less a matter for either Trump or Biden. This is less a matter of persuading undecided candidates in the middle to come in their direction. Rather, this is a question of motivating voters who occupy the ideological base of their respective parties, but for some reason or another, haven't yet determined that they're definitely going to vote. So to give you a couple of examples here, religious conservative voters, evangelical voters, and fundamentalists represent a voting group that has moved slightly, and I emphasize very slightly, away from Trump and toward Biden in this year's election compared to 2016. But there are much larger numbers of religious conservative voters who are not as motivated, who are not as convinced that they're going to turn out and vote this year for President Trump's reelection. On the flip side, as we've talked about on this webinar a number of times, Biden is still working to motivate his party's ideological base. Progressive voters, most notably young people and African Americans, those voter groups are beginning to become more certain of their likelihood to vote. The challenge that Biden is still facing is with Latino and Latina voters, and we'll talk more about that a little bit today, but more next week and in the weeks ahead. So we've got three groups of undecided voters, really. We've got those who genuinely don't know who they're going to vote for, and that, like I said, is an unusually small number this year. We've got the so-called leaners, who have identified their preference for one candidate or the other, who are not decided. But most importantly, we have those voters who are undecided about whether they'll be voters or not. And as I said, that is much more of a motivational challenge for both campaigns and their respective bases than it is one of persuasion. Since we're on the subject, though, of public opinion polling, I want to offer you a couple reminders about polls that we've discussed in past webinars. Number one, as all of you know, the Electoral College means that state polls are much more important than the national results. And so while Biden continues to retain a lead of roughly 8 points in the average of most of the respected national polls, I'm going to take just a minute here to go through some of the key swing states. And then what we'll do starting this week and in the weeks ahead is dig a little bit deeper into at least one of the key contested states for a little bit more information. So what are we seeing around the country? Well, we're seeing in the state of Michigan, the most recent polling has Biden ahead by roughly 4 points. So it's a small lead just within the margin of error, but Biden's still running ahead. In Pennsylvania, Biden has a larger lead, depending on the poll you look at over the last 30 days, a margin of anywhere between 7 and 9 points advantage for Biden in the state of Pennsylvania. In the state of Arizona, again, Biden has a small lead, right about on the margin of error, between 3 points and 5 points advantage for Biden, depending on the polls you cite. And in the key state of Florida, the NBC News poll, which made a huge amount of news and got a tremendous amount of attention, shows the race tied in Florida. There's a couple of other polls there that show Biden with a small lead between 3 and 5 points. And the key there I mentioned earlier are Latino and Latina voters. Because in Florida, unlike in California and many other states, large pluralities of the Hispanic American vote are Cuban Americans and more recently emigres from the country of Venezuela. And because of the unique politics in both of their home countries, they've become somewhat more supportive of Trump. I'd say that one of Biden's greatest, most important goals in the next few weeks is to win back a larger number of those non-Cuban voters in Florida, because right now that race really is too close to call. The second point I'd make, other than the importance of state polls versus national polling at this point in the campaign, is just to offer you a reminder, because this is a really easy temptation to fall into, and I find myself doing it as well. It's really important to remember, though, The polls aren't designed to predict an outcome. As I've said before, and as I'm sure many of you have heard in many other places, a poll is a snapshot in time of what the electorate feels at a given moment when that poll is taken. So polls aren't designed to predict an outcome on election day. The reason they're done, the greatest value in public opinion polling isn't to say, well, we know Trump will win the state or we know Biden will win that state. Rather, the real value in a poll is to share insight on what the voters are thinking. What could drive their vote? What factors are they considering as they weigh their decision? And so we're going to dig a little bit deeper for just a minute or two into my home state of Wisconsin, which, as all of you know, is one of the key swing states in this election, as it was 4 years ago. So earlier this week, there was a new Washington Post ABC poll of the state of Wisconsin. And that poll showed Biden with a lead of 6 points, just outside of the margin of error. So not a comfortable lead of it, a small one. But that margin isn't what's most important from these poll numbers. What I want to do is dig a little bit deeper, as I said a moment ago, on how voters are making their decisions in that key swing state. So what the Post ABC poll did is that they asked Wisconsin voters what those voters considered to be the most important issue in this year's campaign. 27% of the voters of Wisconsin said that the economy was the most important issue. 23% said the coronavirus was the most important issue, and after that came crime and public safety, and then healthcare. But here's what's interesting: when you break down the numbers to see which candidate voters support based on what issue is more important to them, you see a tremendous dichotomy in that state. And I'll be keeping a look going forward as to whether we see similar trends at the national level or in other key swing states. Let me give you some examples. For voters in Wisconsin, in that key swing state, who believe that the economy is the most important issue, they are supporting Donald Trump's reelection by an immense margin of 84% for Trump, 12% for Biden. So the roughly just over 1/4 of voters in that state who are voting based on the economy, they're voting for Trump in immense numbers. On the other hand, those Wisconsin voters who are casting their ballot based primarily on their concern about the coronavirus, they're supporting Joe Biden by even larger numbers than that. 88% of Wisconsin voters who say that the coronavirus is the most important issue to them, 88% are voting for Biden and only 8% for Trump. We'll go a little bit further down on issues of crime and public safety. Trump also enjoys a very, very large margin among that portion of the electorate, by a margin of 83% for Trump to 15% for Biden. And on healthcare, presumably separated out from the more specific coronavirus concerns, Biden's lead is 77% to 19%. So here's a takeaway for you to think about, not just this week, but going forward until the election. The key for both campaigns at this point isn't convincing voters to change their mind on an issue, to decide that one candidate is better or worse on an issue than they previously thought. For both campaigns now, the key is to change the voter's mind on which issue is most important. And as we see in those Wisconsin numbers, when voters make that decision, it becomes much easier to see how those voters line up in a final vote tally. So as we move on to the second topic, I'm going to ask all of you that question. And for those of you who are strong Biden or Trump supporters, I don't want you to choose an issue based on the numbers I just showed you. What I'd like you to do is to tell us truthfully which of these domestic policy issues will be the most important for you when you cast your vote this fall. And it's an anonymous poll, so if you're a Trump voter who happens to say coronavirus or a Biden voter who happens to say jobs in the economy, we're not going to tell anybody. But the nice thing about a secret ballot, whether on election day or here, is you get to tell us what you really think. So our options here are: number 1, jobs in the economy; number 2, coronavirus; 3, race relations and social justice; 4, public safety and violent crime; and 5, climate change. So which of these 5 domestic policy issues will be most important for you, each of you, as a voter, when you cast your ballot this fall? Claire, how did we do? What do we get? Well, look at that. 14% say jobs in the economy. 58% say coronavirus. Race relations and social justice and public safety and violent crime, we can add up to roughly 13%. And climate change is 15%. And so what I want to do now as we shift into the second topic is I want to talk about that climate change number, because the second topic we're going to be discussing today are the California wildfires and the politics underneath them and the political ramifications and the impact over the fires and the debate over them. So 15% of you said the climate change was the most important issue. It's worth remembering that way back early this year, back in January and February, it ranked much, much higher in voters' concerns. For most of the primary season, the Democratic candidates talked about climate change a lot. But then the nomination fight concluded. The coronavirus shut down America. A deep recession devastated the economy. And the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor led to a nationwide discussion of race relations, police reform, and public safety. So last month in late August, the very respected Pew Research Center poll went out and asked voters to rank the issues that were most important to them. And as you might suspect, the economy and coronavirus were the top two. Climate change ranked 11th of 12th on that list of most important issues. 11th of 12th. And while that, I'll admit that that surprised me, I'll also argue that given the practicalities of the campaign, that actually suits both Donald Trump and Joe Biden just fine. Trump, of course, argues that climate change simply does not exist. But for Joe Biden, it's a more complicated matrix. Biden has laid out a fairly aggressive plan by historical measures to combat climate change, certainly more aggressive than any previous Democratic presidential candidate has before 2020. But it's still not nearly as ambitious a plan as the progressive base of his party demands. So Biden, because he needs to attract support from Rust Belt swing voters, who tend to be very wary of the economic impact of greenhouse gas legislation, Biden hasn't gone out of his way to highlight the issue either. So neither one of them has been talking about it at all until this week, and that's because of the wildfires. So Trump hadn't talked about our wildfires for weeks, at least not in public, but he came to California on Monday for a briefing from state officials. And so Biden used that as an opportunity to give a speech of his own in which he attacked the president for ignoring the climate change threat. Trump blamed the fires on poor forest management. Biden called him a climate arsonist. And by the following morning, both campaigns had moved on to other issues. And at least for me, the one-day emergence of the climate change issue served as a really stark reminder of how little attention it was getting in the presidential campaign. But that's nothing new. And while it is the presence of the pandemic and the recession have driven it to some degree, if you look back at previous elections pre-pandemic, you see that climate change tends not to be a high-profile issue for candidates in the past either. Look here in California, when Gavin Newsom ran for governor in 2018, just 2 years ago. Newsom's platform, if you look back, primarily emphasized healthcare, early childhood programs, and higher education. This year before the pandemic, his focus was almost completely on affordable housing and homelessness, not greenhouse gas emissions. And now, to be fair, Newsom has consistently advocated policy changes that call for a shift, an accelerated shift to carbon-free fuels. It hasn't been a high-profile legislative goal since he took office. If you look at the national stage, you see the same thing. Every Democratic candidate this year supported sweeping climate change. But the two candidates who built their campaigns around the issue, Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington State, and Tom Steyer, the businessman, they received very little attention and even less support. And so even though they're competitors, the rest of the field argued over various iterations of a Green New Deal. There's little evidence that that debate moved a lot of votes in the Democratic primary. So look, lots of people, most people, care about climate change. The question is how much they care about it. Voters and politicians care enough about the issue to have pushed for an expansion of alternative energy and green technology, to crack down on emissions from public utilities and large industrial interests. But the next steps are going to be much harder. And for those who feel strongly about the issue, you're going to need to find a way to dramatically broaden your base of support to keep the issue from fading from the minds of voters who aren't watching wildfires burn in their own communities. So let's move on now, and let's talk for a few minutes before we open up to your questions. Let's talk a little bit about international affairs, especially the US-Europe relationship. And so what I want to do right now is, before we get into it, from my perspective, is once again, Claire, if we can post a question for our group. Question number one, how would you assess the US-Europe relationship right now? Is it as strong as ever? Is it stronger than ever? Is it weaker than in the past, but still a strong relationship? Or has the relationship become very weak? And we'll be interested in hearing your thoughts on this. And then I'll dive into my own analysis in just a minute. Well, look at this. 1% say as strong as ever. 0% say stronger than ever. No one. Weaker than in the past, but still strong. That's a plurality of 37%, a little bit more than a third. 61% say weak. So 98 or 99% of our respondents categorize the relationship between US and Europe as, I'd add those two categories together, of concern. So before I dig in deeper, Claire, maybe we can put another question to the group and see how they respond to this one. What do you think? This is a broader question, not just Europe, but a more sweeping question. What sort of role do you think the US should play in the world? And I realize it's a horribly overly simplistic question, but we really do want to get a sentiment of all of your thinking. Should the US play a dominant role, a more active role than is currently the case? The same level of engagement is currently, a minimal role, a smaller role than currently, or no role in the world stage at all? So once again, let's see what you think, and we can use that as the basis for the discussion going forward. Well, not surprisingly, given the stated purpose of the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, 24%, roughly a quarter, say a dominant role. 68% say a more active role. So you add those up and you're a little bit over 90%. 5% say the same as present. 2% say a minimal role, which could be less, could be the same. But either way, an organization that bases its membership on interest in international issues, not surprising that we see such large numbers for either a dominant or a more active role. And we'll talk in future weeks about that distinction between a dominant and an active role. But what I do want to talk about for a few minutes, going back to Europe, is to talk about how that relationship between our country and between the members of the European Union has weakened in recent years. Many of you, like me, watched the recent debate at the United Nations over sanctions on Iran. And it was instructive to me as to what it said about the state of US-Europe relationships. Because while the United States was advocating for extended sanctions and the so-called snapback sanctions, no European country voted with the United States. Not France, not Germany, not even Great Britain voted in support of our sanctions. In the past, even when these countries have disagreed, they've tended to come along grudgingly. But the fact that none even bothered to put up a vote tells us a lot about where that relationship is right now. More recently, just this week, the White House hosted a signing ceremony establishing diplomatic relations between Israel, between the United Arab Emirates, and between the Kingdom of Bahrain. The only European country represented at the signing ceremony was Hungary. None of our other traditional Western allies even bothered to show. And it's become increasingly clear that Europe no longer looks to the United States for leadership or even involvement in most international issues. We'll talk in the future about the current crisis over Brexit and what that could do could have just catastrophic effects on the relationship between Great Britain and the countries of the European continent. What's notable to me is the absence of the US in this discussion, and that neither Great Britain nor the European Union has asked the US to play a particularly large role. And so even with the president more committed to internationalism, whether that's Biden next year or maybe someone like Marco Rubio 4 years from now, the certainty and reliability that most of the West has had for the United States for decades, for generations, is gone. And the question is that if the United States does elect a more internationalist president going forward, either in 2020 or 2024 or in the future after that, how long will it take to repair that relationship? I want to hasten to say that this is not a partisan criticism. As it happens, Donald Trump is an economic nationalist, but there are certainly similar isolationist tendencies at the base of the Democratic Party as well. And while Biden does tend to be more globalist, although his recent economic speech over the summer does sound a bit more protectionist than Democratic presidential nominees have sounded in the past, there are plenty of globalists in the Republican Party establishment as well, people like Rubio, people like Mitt Romney, and others. So that's not a partisan assessment on my part, but just simply noting that economic nationalism and populist isolationism are rising forces in American politics on both sides of the aisle. And one of the challenges for our next president, whether Trump's successor takes office in a few months or in 4.5 years, is to think about how to rebuild those relationships when so many Americans are very suspicious, if not hostile, toward heightened international engagement on the part of the United States. I've talked in the past about the speech that Biden gave on this issue and the fact that he did seem to be moving a bit further away from an international economic agenda than either Clinton or Barack Obama had in their presidential campaigns. And that's a conversation we can talk about more on another day. But for right now, I've talked long enough, at least unilaterally. And so I will wrap this up and we'll move from the monologue into the question and answer period, which at least for me is a much more interesting part of every week's webinar. So Jessica, how are we doing? What have we got in terms of questions from our group?
We have a lot of questions, so let's jump right in. The first question, when Trump questions the results of the election, who will carry through that process? Will it be Attorney General Barr?
Who will carry through the process on behalf of the president? There's not a great deal of precedent for this, so we don't know. Given the role that Barr has played lately, and I'd say it's very likely that he would take the lead role on this. But whether it's the Attorney General, whether it's the White House counsel's office, whether it's the Trump campaign itself, I have to admit I don't feel confident in predicting that answer. What is interesting, for those of you who might not have seen it, is that Dan Coats, who was Trump's director of national intelligence for the first 2+ years of his administration, wrote a fascinating op-ed piece in the New York Times this morning. And what Coats is suggesting is that Congress appoint now a bipartisan commission to oversee the election and election results. And his argument, and it makes a lot of sense, is because there's so much uncertainty about the process, both pre and post-election, and because so much of that uncertainty is likely to manifest itself in all sorts of partisan maneuvering and finger pointing, Coates' suggestion, as Trump's own former director of national intelligence, is let's have Congress now appoint a bipartisan entity that the American people can look to for a little bit more clarity without the partisan suspicions that would exist from other sources. So I don't know the mechanics of how a Trump challenge would work, but it is worth noting that any number of people, including the former director of national intelligence, are thinking about how to protect against not just confusion, but possible unrest if the election is not decided on the evening of November 3rd.
Thank you. Do you agree with the Lincoln Project that they only need to convert 4% of Republicans to win the election for Biden?
Well, the people who run the Lincoln Project, these are a bunch of Republican political strategists who believe very strongly that Trump ought to be defeated, both for the sake of their party and for the sake of the country. As the questioner accurately notes, say, if 96% of Republicans vote for Trump and only 4% vote for Biden, that's enough. I don't know that you can look at I'm not arguing against those figures. I just don't think you can look at them in isolation, because to a large degree, it gets back to a question we were talking about earlier, and that's voter turnout. If evangelical and religious conservative voters do not turn out in as high numbers as they have in elections past, well, then it won't even take 4% of Republicans to switch over to Biden. If Biden's base, if young people and voters from communities of color do not turn out in large numbers, then it's going to take more of a switch. So the point that the Lincoln Project strategists are making is less one of statistical specificity and more one of just how few votes they would need to change in order to affect the election results. And as I think we know from having watched the 2016 election and now watching the polls in this campaign, I think we can agree with that broader supposition that if the Lincoln Project or anyone else is able to move a relatively small number of votes in one direction or another, that is going to have a tremendous impact, if only because the campaign is so close. I don't know that it's worth digging down in the numbers quite that far, but the broader premise is an accurate one.
Thank you. Why are there sometimes a huge contrast between different polls, especially in the Midwestern states, where some polls have a 5 to 6 point lead for Biden and some that have a couple point lead for Trump?
Yeah. Well, every poll, every public opinion poll, whether at the state or the national, or for that matter, the international level, is based on educated guesswork. And let me explain a little bit further. The key to public opinion polling is not simply surveying 100 or 500 or 1,000 people and tallying up the responses. The key is figuring out which of your respondents are actually going to vote on election day and which aren't. And that's why most respected public opinion polls right around Labor Day shift from surveying all registered voters to only surveying likely voters. And different polls define likely voter in different ways. Some of them rely heavily on the voter's own self-reporting, how likely they are to vote, how excited they are about their candidate. Many others look at past election behavior. If a voter participated in most or all of the last elections, they're much more likely to be included in the poll sample. And the challenge there is there are a lot of people in this country who don't vote in every election. And even if they're not considered likely voters, they can still turn out. And even those who are likely voters sometimes stay home. In 2016, voters in small town and rural America voted in much larger numbers for Donald Trump than they had for Mitt Romney or John McCain or George Bush in elections past. Because they weren't considered likely voters because they hadn't voted regularly in the last few elections, they were not counted in as heavy numbers in pre-election public opinion polls. In 2008 and 2012, young people and voters from communities of color who were considered to be unlikely voters because of their lower participation rates in previous elections turned out larger than expected numbers. And so that inflated Obama's margin beyond what many people thought, or what many polls predicted he would have won against either McCain or against Romney. So as we've talked about on this webinar before, the best way to read the polls is not to try to figure out which one is right, which one is wrong. Don't make yourself crazy asking, is the candidate 3 points ahead or 5 points ahead, or is the race all tied? The key, and we'll start doing this next week, I didn't do it earlier in this program today, but I will going forward, is to look back at previous polls that had been taken by that same entity. So if Biden and Trump are tied in a state, and Biden was ahead by 5 points a month or two earlier. We don't know what the actual balance is, but we know that things are trending in the right direction for Trump. If they're tied in a state and Trump was ahead by 5 points a few weeks earlier, we still don't know exactly what the margin is, but we do know that things are trending toward Biden. So rather than comparing the polls against each other, number one, take a look at their trajectory, and I will start doing that next week and for the rest of the campaign. And then second, the Real Clear Politics website does a terrific job of offering averages of the polls that they consider to be most credible. And because there is a margin of error of 4 or 5 points in every poll, they're not all going to be identical. But the averages, again, even if they can't give us a precise statistical breakdown, at the very least, they can give us a sense of where the race is. So a little bit like what I said in the answer to the question about the Lincoln Project, don't get too caught up in the specific numbers. Watch the broader trend and the broader dynamic, and that'll help you more than anything to figure out where the race has been and where it may be headed.
Thank you. That sounds really great. I look forward to seeing your analysis on all of this, because it is a lot to take in, and you have the background to analyze it. So, thank you. Is Trafalgar using the right approach to add shy Trump voters that don't appear in their polls or anyone else's?
So this is a fascinating question, and some of you might not be familiar with the term shy Trump voter. And all easy jokes aside, the concept is, as it's been described in public opinion research in the past, is what's called social desirability. And for many decades throughout the history of polling, there has been an ongoing concern that, particularly as it relates to phone polling, that often voters will tell the person making the call and taking the poll what they think that pollster wants to hear, as opposed to what they really believe. I mentioned this in the past, and so those of you with longer memories may remember all the way back to the 1980s when this dynamic was referred to as the Bradley effect, when Tom Bradley, the then mayor of Los Angeles, an African-American man, ran for governor twice against George Deukmejian, lost both races, but in 1982, in that first campaign, he was widely expected to win because the polls showed him running ahead. And what became clear that back in that era, almost 4 decades ago, is that there were a lot of voters who would never vote for an African-American candidate, but didn't want to tell a pollster that, even if it was someone who they'd never meet, who they were just talking to over the telephone. And as the years have passed, as more and more voters have become comfortable with voting for female candidates and candidates from minority communities, sometimes the social desirability manifests itself in other ways. There was an argument in 2016 and an argument that has recurred this year that many Trump voters, while they're certain to pull the ballot for him, are aware that that is a position that is, in some circles, socially undesirable. And so they tell pollsters that they are not supporting Trump, even though they are. The reason I don't think that this is going to have a significant impact on this election, there are actually 2 reasons for that, Jessica. One, I think I've mentioned this to this group before, the influx of online public opinion polling has demonstrated that social desirability is less of an impact when someone clicks a box online than when they talk to a pollster on the phone. I will never meet or see that pollster face to face, but I might still want to tell him or her what I think they want to hear. When I'm clicking a box online, there's no social desirability influx. And so we haven't seen much difference, or social desirability impact, excuse me. And so we haven't seen much difference between phone and online polling in this election, which makes me think that most Trump voters are not unwilling or are willing to tell pollsters what they think. The other reason, fascinating article in the Washington Post just in the last couple of days that compared Trump's poll numbers in states where there are key Senate races this year. And in all of those states, with the exception of Maine, where Susan Collins, the Republican incumbent, is running well behind her opponent, Sarah Gideon, and every other state where there's a contested Senate race, Trump is running ahead of the Republican candidate on the ballot. So Trump is running ahead of Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, ahead of Martha McCallum in Arizona, ahead of John James in Michigan, and so on around the country. And logic would suppose, as this Post article mentions, that if there are voters who are unwilling to tell pollsters that they're voting for Donald Trump, then it would seem logical that his poll numbers would be lower than the Republican candidates for down ticket office. But the fact that he's drawing numbers suggests that voters are not particularly shy about telling pollsters that they're voting for him. No way to predict this absolutely. We'll see on election day and in all likelihood on the days following. But it doesn't appear, at least at this point, that there doesn't appear to be a lot of evidence as to an uncounted or unwilling to be counted Trump vote.
Thank you. So as a follow-up to that, this questioner asks, do you think there are Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida voters who might feel they should say they are voting for Trump due to social pressure when they might really plan to vote for Biden? The opposite is often proposed, but what about a change in the direction of Biden?
I think I'd give the same answer on this as I did previously. If there were a social desirability factor going in either direction, it would seem to me that we'd see a difference between online and phone polling. And for the most part, the results from most online polls are not coming in considerably different than the phone polls. So I think most voters, at least not all, but most voters are sufficiently confident in the anonymity of the polling process that they're not misleading pollsters. Once again, just like 2016 was an election that defined all sorts of new norms in American politics, 2020 could as well. But at least at this point, it doesn't appear that there's a lot of secret voters for either candidate, that most people who are being asked by pollsters are telling them what their real preference is.
Thank you. Do you think people who say they are undecided, do you think people are really undecided, or do you think they just don't want to say who they are voting for?
To the extent that there is a shy Trump voter, it's more likely that voter would tell. It's more likely that voter would tell people, pollster, that they're undecided rather than supporting Biden, or vice versa. But as we talked about at the very beginning of the webinar, the number of undecided voters in this election is historically small. Between 3 and 5 or 6% is much lower than historical norms. And so there's less room, I would think, for a hidden Trump voter or a hidden Biden voter among undecided voters than there would be under normal circumstances, simply because there are fewer of them.
Awesome. All right, thank you. Let me get back up to the top here. I've talked to 3 people lately who don't like Trump because of his behavior, but won't vote for Biden because he supports abortion rights. Are we back to single issue voting?
I don't think so. I don't think we're back to single issue voting. And if we are, that issue is much more likely to be the economy, the pandemic, or crime and public safety. I mentioned the Pew survey earlier, which ranked the top 12 issues in terms of voter interest. I mentioned that climate change ranked 11th. Much to my surprise, abortion ranked 12th of the 12 issues. So that's not to say that there aren't large numbers of voters on both sides of the aisle who believe that it's an extremely important issue. But in a time of recession, in a time of a heightened debate over race relations, in a time of a continued struggle to deal with the coronavirus, the issue certainly hasn't disappeared. But the number of voters who are basing their decisions solely on the issue of abortion is smaller than it has been in some time. This gets back to the point that I was making earlier about a campaign's goal in the last weeks of a campaign. Neither the Biden or the Trump campaign, no campaign, is ever going to convince a voter to switch their opinion on the critical issue of abortion right before an election. That's not what they're trying to do. What the campaigns are trying to do instead is to convince voters that the issues on which they agree with that voter are the issue on which they should cast their vote. And so the Trump campaign is working very, very hard to convince pro-life voters, even the shrinking number of pro-life Democrats, that that is the issue they should vote on. But it is a smaller target audience than it ever has been before. Granted, in a small election, these small pockets of voters can make a huge amount of difference. But again, just given the very unusual nature of the political landscape right now, it appears that fewer voters, both pro-choice and pro-life, will cast their ballots primarily or exclusively on that issue than has been the norm since the passage of Roe versus Wade.
Thank you. What is your thought on causality of economics versus coronavirus? My thought is that, as Churchill said, where you stand depends on where you sit. In other words, Trump supporters say the economy is most important, while Biden supporters say coronavirus.
I think there's a couple of different ways at that question. The American public, in very large numbers, has said that they don't, or has told pollsters that they don't believe that the president has handled the virus very effectively. So it's not surprising that for those voters who make it their most important issue, that those voters are overwhelmingly for Biden. And while the economy is certainly not strong at this point, many voters, having watched the first 3 years of Trump's presidency, are much more likely to give him credit for those years of economic growth. And we still see that the economy is the only issue. When voters are matched the two candidates head to head, the economy is the only issue on which they believe that Trump would be more effective. On every other issue, from the pandemic to healthcare and so on down the line, they choose Biden, even by a small number, on issues relating to crime and public safety. But what's interesting about the questioner's point, and particularly his or her use of that Churchill quote, "Where you stand is based on where you sit," is more and more public opinion research is showing that the voters' opinion of the economy is less determinative than it was in the past in terms of casting their vote. Because, and there is public opinion research to back this up, more and more voters assess the economy based on their partisan standing rather than their economic standing. So we look back to 2016, when large majorities of Republicans said the economy was doing very poorly, and equally large numbers of Democrats said it was doing very well. And pre-pandemic in January, February of 2020, it was exactly reversed. Most Republicans were saying the economy was doing well. Most Democrats were saying it was doing poorly. The same dynamic exists on other issues. But the difference here is that for many, many years, voters tended to come to their decisions about the economic climate based on their own experience and their own economic situation. Now they become much more likely to answer in a purely partisan way. If the president is from their party, they're happy with the economy. If he or someday she is from the other party, they tend to think much less of it. So the questioner's supposition is exactly right, and the quote from Churchill works perfectly in this situation.
Thank you. Got smart audience members.
As usual.
Yeah. A recent poll had an equal number of people that consider both Trump and Biden unfit for the presidency. Your thoughts?
Well, these voters are what we call double haters, voters who don't like either candidate. And if they turn out to vote, they vote for the least objectionable of the two. In 2016, the so-called double haters, those voters who did not like either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, voted for Trump by a pretty decent-sized margin. In this election, those voters who do not think highly who do not think favorably of either Trump or Biden are voting for Biden in much, much larger numbers. And so there was a larger group in 2016 of voters who disliked both candidates. But even though it's a slightly smaller group this year, they seem to have switched sides. And instead of wanting to give the new guy in 2016, they wanted an outsider. In 2020, at least those double haters are leaning heavily towards someone with more political experience.
Thank you. We are getting a lot of questions on the Abraham Agreement, so I don't know if you want to get into that now or if you want to save that for next week. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think we've already agreed, and I know that many of you had the opportunity to talk with General Allen and with Fiona Hill about it earlier this week. But one of our 3 topics next week will be to talk about the Middle East in general, and more specifically about the agreement between Israel and the Emirates in Bahrain. But why don't we try a question on it now, and then we'll save the rest of it for next week. How about that, Jessica?
That sounds good. All right, this question, please discuss the Abraham Agreement and its true significance, given that it simply codifies what has been going on for a long while.
Okay. Particularly in the Middle East, you should never underestimate the importance of codifying. In other words, the fact that 2 Arab nations were willing to take official steps and publicly recognize relations with Israel is an important step forward in the country. And I'm not the first person to say this. I've seen any number of commentators on both sides of the aisle make this point, that even those voters who are very strong opponents of the president should acknowledge that this represents an important step forward, but also that strong supporters of the president should recognize it's only a step. It's a really important one. It's the first time in a quarter of a century that an Arab country has signed an agreement like this with the state of Israel. And I think what sets this apart is both Egypt and Jordan, Egypt in the 1970s and Jordan in the 1990s, signed that agreement under duress. There were very immediate security concerns and almost economic emergencies in those 2 countries that required a change of direction. Neither Bahrain or United Arab Emirates is facing that kind of emergency situation. Both seem to sign this agreement. And it's important to note that while Saudi Arabia is not a signatory, it could not have occurred without at least their silent assent. It's worth noting that neither one of them was in an emergency situation and is doing so for longer term goals. And what seems to be beginning to happen in the Middle East, and it's taken many more years than I would have thought, to be quite honest about it, is that for many Arab countries, not all, but at least for many of the Sunni countries, hatred of Israel is becoming a less important consideration than fear of Iran. And that as the Middle East realigns itself from Arabs versus Israel to Sunnis versus Shiites, that has created an opportunity for Israel. And the UAE leadership in particular deserves credit for recognizing that opportunity. I wasn't in the meeting, so I don't know exactly the extent of the role that the Trump administration played. But I will say it's very, very clear that much of the impetus here did come from the leadership of the Emirates, and they deserve great credit for it. So 6 weeks before an election, everything is partisan presidential politics. But for those who do want to see peace in the Middle East, I think it is important to note that this is an important step in that direction, but it is only a step.
Thank you. And this is kind of a broader question, but it does focus on that agreement. Isn't it the case that everyone now will assume that any treaty or agreement with the US will be valid only for the duration of the governing administration?
Well, this gets back to the conversation we were having earlier about Europe. And you can make the same case in the Pacific Rim, because as the United States tries to line up some of the smaller Asian countries against China, they're very wary about picking sides because they worry that the US might not be as reliable an ally. Once again, I think this is a question or a challenge that's going to fall to the next president, whether it be a Democrat this upcoming January or a Republican in 4 years, as the case may be. But it's going to take a while. It's going to take a long time to rebuild the trust and to rebuild this sense of consistency that many felt toward this country in the post-World War II era. It didn't, this lack of trust and lack of consistency didn't happen overnight. And once again, this isn't a partisan issue. You can point to examples from prior administrations to Trump's that contributed to this. But whether it's European countries, whether it's that are worried about their security, whether it's Pacific Rim countries worried about China, or whether it's Gulf and other Arab countries worried about Iran. Those countries don't feel like they can look to the United States with as much assuredness as they once did in the past, ironically. And then we should probably move on to another topic. I would argue that lack of reliability, ironically enough, is one of the things that drove the Emirates and Bahrain to sign the deal, realizing that if the US is not going to be as reliable an ally for them going forward, then they need Israel as an ally to help fill some of the gap that the lack of consistency from the US has created.
Interesting. All right. So yes, moving on to another topic. How much do you think government at state and federal level pursues certain goals like climate change, even if it is not at the top of the list of the mass of voters? In the case of climate change, what do you think that leaders need to do to combine economic negative impacts with transitions to new jobs for workers negatively impacted?
Right, so two great questions. And because we're a little bit short on time, I'll focus on the first, and hopefully we'll have a chance to come back to questions like the second one in future webinars. But it's a really interesting and a really important philosophical question. To what extent do our elected leaders push for policy goals, even if the public isn't clamoring for them? And I think the best leaders in both parties, if there are policy goals that need to be achieved, they're going to push for them regardless of whether the public is paying attention or not. It's difficult for them to do that in the face of public opposition. But with climate change, it's not a matter of most Americans opposing aggressive climate change legislation. It's just not being that invested in its passage. And so what I would say is that the best leaders in both parties will push forward toward policy change, even if the public isn't paying attention. The more ambitious, the more difficult that policy change, the more necessary it is to have strong public support. So as I said earlier, expanding the use of solar and wind power, increasing reliance on green technology and alternative energies, that's relatively uncontroversial. So even while voters aren't paying a great deal of attention to climate change issues, that's the kind of thing that elected officials can accomplish. But the next set of changes, as I said earlier, the next set of changes are going to be much more difficult. It's one thing to tell publicly owned utilities or large-scale industrial users that they have to cut back on emissions. But the next level of greenhouse gas cuts is going to come from drivers, from residential properties, from small homes and small businesses. And that is a much, much tougher set of challenges to accomplish. So I don't know that elected officials are going to be able to accomplish those next goals without not so much growing public support, but intensifying it. Because those homeowners, those business owners, those drivers who are going to be impacted by the next set of reforms are going to push back much harder. And the only way a politician can succeed in the face of that kind of opposition is if their supporters aren't just on their side, but care deeply enough to engage on their side.
Helps if I'm not muted. Thank you so much. Any closing remarks? I know Kim is having some technical issues, so I will close us out.
And why don't we try to put in one more question, and I'll do my best to give a short answer for it, and then you and I
can. Let me see here. This morning's New York Times features a suggestion for Congress to establish an election commission to oversee the election. Will this diminish the sanctity of our democracy?
So I'd mentioned earlier that the former Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, has called for a bipartisan commission to be formed to oversee the election. And I don't think that's a threat to democracy. I think one of the things that voters are going to need in the aftermath of this election is a source of information that they can find to be reliable and not colored by partisan preferences. And so this commission, as I understand what Coats is proposing, would not play a direct role in counting the votes or passing legislation or changing policy on how elections are run, but rather simply overseeing the process and offered ideally a considered and nonpartisan overview to the American public I don't think that's a threat to democracy. And in fact, I think it could serve a very important reassuring role, even if the function is oversight rather than direct implementation. So that's all I got, Jessica.
Well, that's
You
a
want to
lot,
thank
so thank
everybody
you.
for being such an amazing group, or should I?
Why don't you go ahead? They'd love to hear it from you.
Okay. So I'll fill in for Kim this week, and unfortunately, I do not have the schedule of upcoming events. But the great thing is, you can find it without much problem at www.lawac.org. See all our upcoming programs, and there's quite a bit of exciting stuff coming up, particularly in our election series. And of course, Jessica and I'll be back here next week at 11 Pacific time for the next in our politics in the time of coronavirus webinar series. We're very grateful to all of you for being here with us, and we'll hope to see you again soon. Oh yes, and thank you. And if you'd like to keep politics in the time of coronavirus free and open to the public, text Schnur. And please don't misspell it the way most people do. It's SCHNUR. Text Schnur to 800-597-0631. Thank you all for being with us, and thank you very much for your support. We're very grateful to you, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Dan.